Welcome back to another episode of Sacred Wild Man. My name is Roy, and today I will be going into the third episode of the series, Reclaiming Masculinity. Now, if you have not watched the first two, I recommend that you go and watch those first, as each episode does build on the last one. And today's topic is on why men must break up with their mothers. And the main idea of this video is that if a man cannot free himself of his mother complex, he will fail to develop healthy relationships with women, especially romantic interests and also relationships with other men. And to begin, I'm going to share a story and a quote from the book Silently Seduced by Kenneth Adams. When she said, "I don't know what I would do if I didn't have you. I wish your father would listen to me like you do." Tom had had enough. He hung up without a word and threw the phone to the floor in a rage. Teary-eyed, he screamed to his wife, "I don't want to know about her personal problems. I hate it, but I don't know what to do." As had happened so many times, Tom's evening with his wife was ruined. So for the men who are watching this video, I'm curious to hear how that quote, how that story resonated with you. What did you feel when you were listening to it? Was it something that you could relate to? Or was it something like you've never really had a problem with? I can say for myself, I deeply relate with that story. And when I first read it, I had to, take a step away from the book and realize that it was talking about me to a T. And this is the case for many men who are still stuck in a mother complex, who were generally raised by single moms, or is your stereotypical mama's boy. And the issue for so many of these men who are stuck in this mother complex, raised by a single mom, a mama's boy, is that, as I said before, they fail to develop healthy relationships with other women, and they can't ever completely separate themselves from their mother psychologically. So when I talk about breakup, I'm not referring to you ignore her and you never talk to your mother again. I'm talking about a mental, emotional, and a psychological separation. This sense that my mom, is her own individual entity, and I am my own individual entity. We're not fused together. And so when men don't address this issue, if they do have this mother complex that they're fused to, often what happens is when they approach relationships with women, they are unconsciously projecting their deepest fears and their deepest hopes. Now, the mother-son bond is nothing to be taken lightly. It is perhaps the most intimate relationship that a child has from the beginning of their life. When you think about an infant inside the mother's womb, right, that is the most intimate places to be, right, inside one's own mother. And so for the sons who are essentially incubating in their mother's womb, they are deeply connected to their mother, right? And not only are they in the womb, but they are also connected by the umbilical cord. And the umbilical cord is where he receives nourishment, that food, for being able to grow and develop. And once he is birthed into this world, what is the first object of contact that he has? It's his mother's breast, right? Breastfeeding. And for the child, that experience is generally one that is very loving and warm. If you think about breastfeeding, it's providing nourishment, it provides warmth, and it also provides softness. And so for the early child, for that infant, it is very comforting, it is very soothing, and it feels protective and safe too. So that doesn't ever go away, because for children in the early years of life, all memory is pre-verbal. None of it is through words. Memories, feelings are stored within the body. They are felt. And so if that is the son's early experience, one of warmth, love, comfort, he's going to have that deeply encoded in his body. And as humans, we gravitate towards pleasure and we move away from pain. So there's always going to be a part of the son that wants to move towards that loving, warmth, nourishing environment. And in speaking to the strength of this mother-son bond, I am not trying to pathologize it. It is in fact very healthy and beautiful. And whether or not a son grows up with or without a mother complex, so let's say he grew up in the most healthy way possible, or he grew up in the least healthy way possible and was deeply fused and connected to his mother in an imbalanced relationship, in both cases, the mother is still the son's first lover. Again, she is the first woman he has the most intimate contact with. She is the one who gave birth to him. Now, this bond, as beautiful as it is, becomes distorted when the mother essentially fuses herself to her child, makes her son into something that he is not. And how this came to be is due to what I mentioned in my previous video, the second episode on the demoralization of men. So watch that one first if you have not seen it. But for those who have, essentially, once fathers had left the home, right? Because in your 1950s, 1960s, more men are leaving the home to travel longer distances for work and for longer hours. So they're just away for a longer period of time. In their absence, the mothers then have to fulfill both the masculine and the feminine roles within the house. So she's the one who takes care of the house, cooks food, cleans, what have you, that which is more, traditionally feminine roles. But then she is now also having to bear responsibility for being the disciplinarian, for kind of keeping her children in check. And so if she's the one who is always managing this, that's a heavy burden for any woman to carry, essentially almost 24/7. And what happens is any dissatisfaction, any resentment, any longing that she has for her husband who is not there to fulfill that, whether that's due to the work situation or just men being more emotionally cut off from themselves, not attuned with their own emotions. She then projects that onto the only male figure that is close to her, and that generally is her son or sons. And when that happens, the son is now essentially shoehorned into a role that is not his. And there's a part of him that likely knows that, but there's also another part of him that wants to step up into that role. Because as children, we all want to please our parents, right? We don't want them disappointed. We want them to be proud of us. We want them to delight in us. And so there is a loving part of the son taking it upon himself to be the one who can make his mother happy. But if that goes on for a long period of time, that creates the mother complex. That creates an unhealthy, fused, enmeshed bond between the two. And so once that happens, the son now becomes what is called a surrogate husband, or some have said a son husband. Coach Greg Adams has, I think, popularized that phrase. And so once that happens, the son now becomes the confidant. The son now becomes a white knight, the one who is there to save his mother from all her woes. So any resentment or disappointment that she feels, he takes it upon himself to try to change that, to make that go away. Any longings, desires that she has, he also tries to step up and make those things happen. Now, while this might feel positive for the son for a period of time, right? Because you feel special. And again, your mother being essentially your first lover, the most intimate relationship you have from birth, there's a part of you that's like, this is awesome, right? We're so connected. But after a while, it gets sticky. And there's a part of the son that also knows this, but he can't quite free himself from it. He also doesn't quite know, because he doesn't have that cognitive development to understand what is happening. And what this is called is covert incest, which is a term coined by Kenneth Adams, and he describes it further in these quotes. Covert incest occurs when a child becomes the object of a parent's affection, love, passion, and preoccupation. The parent, motivated by the loneliness and emptiness created by a chronically troubled marriage or relationship, makes the child a surrogate partner. The boundary between caring love and incestuous love is crossed when the relationship with the child exists to meet the needs of the parent rather than those of the child. As the deterioration in the marriage progresses, the dependency on the child grows, and the opposite sex parent's response to the child becomes increasingly characterized by desperation, jealousy, and disregard for personal boundaries. The child becomes an object to be manipulated and used so the parent can avoid the pain and reality of a troubled marriage. The child feels used and trapped. These are the same feelings overt incest victims experience. Attempts at play, autonomy, and friendship render the child guilt-ridden and lonely, never able to feel okay about his or her needs. Over time, the child becomes preoccupied with the parent's needs and feels protective and concerned. A psychological marriage between parent and child results. The child becomes the parent's surrogate spouse. Others listen to the lectures and insist there is no harm in their close relationship with their opposite sex parent. Actually, they claim to feel special and privileged. These children were given a special position by being idealized by the parent, but there's no privilege in being cheated out of a childhood by being a parent's surrogate partner. As adults, these individuals in turn idealize their parents to cover the pain of the abandoned and victimized child within. To be a parent's surrogate partner is to be a victim of covert incest. There is nothing loving or caring about a close parent-child relationship when it services the needs and feelings of the parent rather than the child. Feeling close with your parents, particularly the opposite sex parent, is not the source of comfort the image suggests. It is a relationship in which the individual, both as a child and later as an adult, feels silently seduced by the parent. Feelings of appreciation and gratitude do not prevail in these close relationships. Instead, they are a source of confusing, progressive rage. Also noteworthy in Tom's story was the competition set up between him and his father. The seduction by his mother pitted Tom against his father. Tom's father naturally felt jealous and competitive toward him. This competition is a frequent dynamic in covert incest, with the same-sex parent usually looking like the bad guy. Tom's father felt pushed out, which may have been part of his mother's unconscious motive. The legitimate anger Tom felt toward his father was due to his father's unwillingness to step in and separate Tom from his mother. Tom's father either perceived the covertly incestuous relationship as too powerful to break into, or was relieved by it since it gave him an excuse to leave the relationship with his wife. Some fathers may consciously push their sons into the arms of the mother to escape the marriage, or perhaps act out in an affair. They abandon the son to the mother for their own self-serving need. So now that we have covered how this mother-son bond becomes distorted, let's look into some of the long-standing impacts of this mother-son complex. In his book Silently Seduced, Kenneth Adams lists some of the characteristics of covert incest. Love-hate relationship towards the mother, emotional distance from the same-sex parent, guilt and confusion over personal needs, feelings of inadequacy, multiple relationships, difficulty with commitment, hasty commitment, regret over past relationships, sexual dysfunction, compulsions, and addictions. Some other impacts that I notice this dynamic has on men is that they are often unavailable to women they are in partnerships with. What happens is that their mom has so much emotional real estate, mental real estate in his mind that he is constantly preoccupied with her. And so his partner could feel like she's competing for his attention with his mother. The flip side of that is because he is unconsciously trying to get away from his mother complex, he can then project that degree of avoidance as attention onto his romantic partner. And how that comes across to her then is an intense amount of clingy, attention-seeking energy. There's this preoccupation with her, and that both of those are very off-putting. Another thing that I notice is that these men tend to lack masculine core. They are not strong in their masculine polarity. And what I mean by that is they're generally not very assertive, not confident, and cannot establish their own boundaries. And so how this comes across to women then is it's very kind of soft. there's not a lot of kind of purpose, vision, drive, or a sense of solidity. And it feels like she is the one who is kind of calling all the shots, making all the decisions. And to be in that state for the entirety of the relationship is also very off-putting for a lot of women. There's this desire to be like, well, can you give me something? Can you push back against me? Or is the only thing you can do is shrink back, which generally a lot of these men do. And one other thing that I notice is that these men tend to utilize manipulation to get their needs met. And using myself as a case study, this was my only way of figuring out how I could get my needs met. Because for a lot of these men, they struggle with believing that their needs matter and that their needs can be met. Because in this fused, covert incest, enmeshed relationship with his mother, this surrogate relationship, he is solely focused on her, right? His mother is the one who is talking about her woes and her longings. And so that takes priority in his life, because if he withdraws his attention, then his core fear then is she will maybe disown him, or she will at least be severely disappointed in him and maybe hate him. And the example for this comes from how she spoke about his father, right? Because there's a splitting that happens. The dad exists as this bad figure, this bad guy. And then mother exists as the good person in the child's mind. And so if he dares to withdraw from his mother, if he dares to put his own needs first from time to time, his fear is that his mother will then see him as his father. You're the bad guy. So he now is, okay, I'm the bad guy now, and I don't want to be like that because mom didn't like that. So I need to swallow my own, desires and needs and put those last. So if that's the only option a person has, the only way they can get those needs met is through indirect ways and manipulation. Because at the end of the day, we all have needs, we all have our own desires. And if we do not address them head on, we're going to go about them in roundabout ways. And so often what this looks like for these men, and also what I experienced myself, is a giving in order to get. So there are terms attached, and oftentimes we don't even say what those terms are. What we do though is kind of bend over backwards to create this image of all right, we're doing everything that you want, even though these women often don't ask for it. But we project what we think they want. We also project what we think will garner her affection, garner her approval. And so the shadow side of that then is, okay, because I have emptied myself out in these ways, I have poured myself out in these ways that you never even asked for, I now have some sort of leverage to, feel entitled to you giving me affection, you meeting my needs, you meeting my desires. But none of this is said directly. It's all kind of in the back of our own minds, subconscious or unconscious. And when those needs are not met, when those desires are not met, it leaves these men feeling very entitled, very resentful and bitter. Now, a few quotes that illustrate this dynamic come from Robert Bly and Guy Corneau, whose books I mentioned in the previous video. The naive man will also be proud that he can pick up the pain of others. He particularly picks up women's pain. When at 5 years old he sat at the kitchen table, his mother may have confided her suffering to him, and he felt flattered to be told of such things by a grown-up, even if it showed his father up poorly. He becomes attracted later to women who share their pain. His specialness makes him, in his own eyes, something of a doctor. He is often more in touch with women's pain than with his own, and he will offer to carry a woman's pain before he checks with his own heart to see if this labor is proper in the situation. Hundreds of times, one man or another has said to me that now, at 40 or 45, he realizes that his task throughout his life has been to be a substitute husband, lover, and sole companion for his mother. He envisions himself as a white knight for womankind. If I ask such a man, "How do you feel about men?" he is likely to say, "I have never been able to trust them." Paul's adult behavior was a repressed form of protest against his mother. It expressed his anger at having been neglected. He was looking constantly for someone who would love him unconditionally. He refused to admit that his childhood was over, that no one now owed him that kind of love. At the same time, he felt guilty about imposing himself on others through extreme behaviors. He therefore tried to gain forgiveness by showing his extreme willingness to help others. He becomes a victim of repetition, looking to women reminiscent of his mother for the things he never got from her, as if he would make up for some terrible emotional wound. If he needs tenderness, he will not look for a sweet, gentle woman, but rather for one who is cold and reserved. Then he can win her over and finally bring out the gentleness in her. Now, because these men generally have a lot of trouble forming healthy relationships with other women, they instead devolve into addictions and compulsive behavior in an attempt to meet those needs, longings, and desires, and to fill the void of pain of not having had those needs or desires met. Bly writes, "The naive man tends to have an inappropriate relation to ecstasy. He longs for ecstasy at the wrong time or in the wrong place, and ignores all masculine sources of it. He wants ecstasy through the feminine, through the great mother, through the goddess, even though what may be grounding for the woman ungrounds him. He uses ecstasy to be separated from grounding or discipline." And for those who are confused what Bly means about feminine sources of ecstasy, my personal understanding is that certain addictions carry more of a feminine type energy. And this harkens back to that original mother-son bond. Because again, that intimate relationship and that place of warmth, nourishment, softness, and comfort is what is being sought out once again. Because the man who has this mother complex is not able to get it from her because he is now in the role of surrogate husband trying to take care of her needs. And so his own get lost along the way. So these addictions might be alcohol, these addictions might be pornography, these addictions can be drugs that create a certain high. And a commonality that I see among all of these, which I categorize as more feminine in energy, is that they're recreating that softness, that warmth, that comfort, right? A lot of people talk about how when they have a drink, they just suddenly relax, and that flush feels warm and comforting to them. And same with drugs or pornography that create this high, right? And especially with pornography, what it does is that it causes a release of oxytocin. So when a man is viewing pornography and also masturbating, he is releasing oxytocin. And oxytocin is what people have frequently referred to as the love hormone or a bonding hormone. It creates this sense of connection. And so when mothers are feeding their infants, there's a huge release of oxytocin between the mother and the infant. And that creates that warm, loving bond. And so I think men who are stuck in these addictions, I can speak in my time of just being addicted to pornography, there really was this sense of trying to get back to something pleasurable, trying to get back to something soft and ecstatic. But unfortunately, a lot of this is misguided and unconscious. It's an unconscious attempt to make up for what is lost. And unfortunately, it cannot fill that void. The reason being is because what exists in that void is the abandoned child self. As Guy Corneau mentioned earlier, that a lot of these men refuse to believe that their childhood is over, and that's why they try to look for it so hard in other women who can kind of meet that wound. Unfortunately, no woman can bear that burden for a man. He must resolve that on his own. And so in my own case, it was coming to terms with that wound, that I missed out on some things, right? There was a part of me that had to grow up faster than I was ready to. And I fulfilled that role of surrogate husband, but in the process, completely repressed and disowned that part of myself that did need that warmth and softness. And so what this means is that a man has to work with that repressed anger and repressed grief in order to truly heal, in order to truly not even fill the void, but to heal that wound. He has to work with the pain. He has to go through the pain. That void cannot be filled by other pleasures or ecstasy to heal the wound. Now, when men are stuck in these patterns of addictions and compulsive behaviors, they are not able to fully grow up. They are not able to transition from boyhood into manhood. They stay stuck there in a childlike mentality, even though in other areas of their life, they might appear to be very masculine, or they appear to be very driven and purposeful. But generally in the areas of relationship, that's where they are lacking. Because again, there's so much dependence on these addictions and compulsive behaviors to symbolically act out a drama that was never healed. Like, they never found closure. So that's why they have these repeated patterns of belief, repeated patterns of behavior. I can't tell you how many men who have said, I don't know why I keep doing this, right? If you think about that coming from an unconscious level, consciously they have no idea what they're doing, but their subconscious is communicating a message, and it's generally in the message of symbols and feelings. Is something happened, right? There was this wound, there was this trauma that happened, usually in childhood, but I never got closure from it. So I need to repeat these behaviors. I need to recreate these scenarios, reenact them, so that perhaps somehow this time I can figure out what went wrong and fix it. Now, in contrast to what Bly was talking about, the feminine sources of ecstasy, he also mentioned the masculine sources of ecstasy. He mentions what is more grounding and discipline. And this is a departure from that warm, loving, nourishing, soft world of the mother and of the feminine. That will be reserved for another video in this series, but I just wanted to mention that these men generally are disconnected from these other more kind of austere, harder, colder, a little bit more cruel forms of masculine nourishment, right? When you think about sports, martial arts, combat, even though they might not be comfortable, there's something within, I would say, most men that feels drawn to that, right? We feel drawn to a sense of strife and challenge and a sense of friction, that we're really challenging ourselves and seeing just what we're made of, what our potential is. But if a man is kind of avoiding those things, he'll never really discover that part of himself and build up his masculine core. Again, he is stuck in that infantile state of, I want this warmth and loving connection relationship with my mother, but I didn't get the fullness of it in my childhood because I fulfilled that surrogate husband role. But damn it, I still want it. I refuse to believe that is over for me. With these dynamics of the mother complex, there are dire consequences for not addressing them. For many men, they live life with a feeling of incompetence, like they can't make things happen in their own life. And they also walk around with a lot of resentment and entitlement and bitterness towards the world. There's a sense that the world is against them, right? Rather than I can make things happen and the world is here to support me, there's a sense of, no, the world is here to screw up all my plans and anything that I want, anything that I need. And so these men are essentially cooking, right, in anger and grief soup. They're just boiling there and marinating there. And when this grief and anger are not processed, when they're not released, when they're not understood in terms of the core wound that they point to, what happens then is that they are often subject to these moments of explosiveness that seemingly come out of nowhere. Now, an example of some of the dire consequences of not addressing this mother complex is the man Gary Ridgway, otherwise known as the Green River Killer. I go into more detail about him in my video, Nice Guys, Downfall of Needing to Be Nice, But one thing that was just fascinating to me about him in terms of what I mentioned earlier, the symbology of trying to reenact and find closure around trauma, is that for him, he had a very fused relationship with his mother, right? If you listen to his story, you listen to some of the interviews or interrogations he had, he talks about his relational dynamic with his mother. One being where she kind of frequently just flaunted herself sexually, kind of just exposed herself. Whether or not that was seduced him, who knows, but it affected him, right? He was aroused as a child seeing his mother's naked body. And at the same time, she was also severely critical towards him, just belittling him. And on that end of the spectrum, he felt a deep hatred and anger towards her. Like there was a sense of, stop belittling me, right? Stop bullying me. But he couldn't ever resolve these emotions within himself and in relationship to his mother. So what did he do? Well, exactly what he was sentenced to life in prison for. He found other vulnerable women who he raped and then killed. Now, to me, it is uncanny the parallel between his relationship with his mother and how he kind of symbolically tried to find closure in his dealings with these women, right? If you think about rape and then killing, there's a level of sexual arousal, but then there's also this murderous hate and rage. That, to me, points directly back to his mother. He was sexually aroused by her, but he also deeply hated her and had a lot of rage towards her. Because that was never resolved, never worked with a therapist or a professional coach, someone to help him understand his feelings and find internal resolvement or resolution, he then had to go outward somewhere, right? This always happens. This has to be addressed. The subconscious will find a way to address it, either, and it's usually indirectly. So we need the power of the conscious mind to say, hey, I need to take care of this. There are some issues here. I need to look into it. If the conscious mind is not on board, then the subconscious will take over. And usually that's through more indirect means, which can also be very devastating. So if a man is struggling with a mother complex and he knows he experiences the issues that I have mentioned in this video thus far, what is a man to do? Well, one of the top things that I can recommend, and was an important part of my journey in healing this, is fully owning and taking responsibility for that anger and grief. It is usually repressed, but it is there. And a helpful way to kind of tap into it is to notice the times where you lose your temper. Notice what triggers or activates you, and begin to break down what is going on there. What are the chain of events that is leading to me feeling so aggravated? And are there any themes here, right? Is there something thematic here, not just in this present moment of my life, but throughout the entirety of my life? Generally, you'll find some breadcrumbs there. I cannot emphasize how important it is to work with a therapist, a coach, or somebody who works in some field of healing modalities. That could be a shamanic practitioner, it could be a body worker, but somebody to help you connect to your emotions, connect you to your body, which is where you feel your emotions. That is where you'll begin to tap into the nonverbal, pre-verbal kind of experiences that your body has stored. And along with it, you'll likely begin to recall memories. Memories where you never had closure, that there was just something there like, I wish that had went better, or I really did want my needs met here, but I didn't get it. Once you can begin to own your anger and grief and then begin to express them, you'll begin to create more room within your body, more flow, more energy flow, because you're no longer stuck, stagnant, holding on to this bitterness, this resentment. Right? You're letting those emotions go, and you're creating more room for other feelings and emotions to fill their place and to continue to flow rather than to stagnate, constrict, and tense up. One other thing that I would recommend is for you to free yourself from the burden to have to save your mother. I know that's easier said than done, but just beginning to repeat that to yourself, that I am freeing myself from needing to save my mother, can be helpful just to shift your mindset by 1 degree. Because a lot of these men feel like if they don't take care of their mother, if they are not there to be her white knight and to save her, she's going to perish. That's not the case. She will survive. But it might not seem that way. And so it's a 2-pronged approach. One is to be able to say, all right, I'm taking a step back from things that I used to do. And that might mean not calling her back immediately. That might mean not texting her immediately. That might mean not divulging aspects of your own life to her, right? Even if she pushes and asks, hey, what's going on? What's going on? That might mean not, rushing to her aid when there is an issue going on that she could probably resolve on her own. And the other side of that 2-pronged approach is doing your own work, right? Working with the part of you that feels like, no, I gotta go save her. I gotta do it. I gotta do it or else something bad is gonna happen, right? That's what needs paying attention to. What is that something bad that you're afraid is gonna happen? And what are you afraid will happen between your relationship with you and your mom? That's usually where that core fear is. Lastly, one thing I would recommend is being able to acknowledge the things that your mother did do well, holding gratitude for that, but also acknowledging areas where she failed, areas where she did not meet your needs or honor your desires, even if she couldn't fulfill them, but at least to say, hey, yeah, your desires are important. I just am not able to meet them. What happens is men often try to see their mother as kind of beyond reproach, right? That even if they experience resentment or bitterness towards her, there's some part of them that can't come to terms with truly believing that she had failed in certain respects. And not so much having the belief, but being able to express that feeling. There's a part of them that is terrified of owning that emotional feeling. And that is a path towards healing, is that if that emotion is not expressed, is not released somehow, he will continue to remain stuck. Now, an example of one way this can be done is through journaling or drama therapy or even a guided visualization. And Guy Corneau, in his book, Absent Fathers, Lost Sons, gives an example of this. With a mixture of laughter and tears, he allowed himself to break the taboo and give in to his rage. The following image then emerged. In the basement of the family home, he hacks his mother to death with an axe and then stomps on her bloody remains in a sort of dance of jubilation. For Alex, this imagining was a radical experience. He finally went to the end of his negative feelings and reached the sadistic murderer within him. The experience calmed him. The negative feelings that had governed him before gradually found expression in more realistic forms. His hatred of his mother transformed into an appreciation of all she had done for him, and little by little he rediscovered his enjoyment of life. So if you notice in that example that Guy Corneau gives, he talks about how Alex was finally able to reach the end of his negative feelings. And at the end, there was a sadistic murderer. But once he cleared that emotion, once he could feel it and actually express it, it no longer held power over him because it no longer dwells in the subconscious anymore. He has consciously found closure there. And the contrast I notice is that was not what Gary Ridgway did, right? He had to hold on to that. It dwelled within his subconscious and it leaked out in very devastating ways. For Alex, because he resolved it, he is no longer in danger of leaking that out into the world onto women who have nothing to do with any of this, right? Because again, it has everything to do with him, his mother, and the mother complex that he has internalized there. Now, for some of you, hearing that story or even considering that might be terrifying. To acknowledge that there might be a sadistic murderer within you, that there might be a part of you who can do terrible violence, right? And feeling that towards women specifically. My encouragement is to work with those feelings, right? Simply to welcome them and observe them. Not identify with them as if okay, that must mean I'm a sadistic murderer. That must mean I'm an evil, violent, terrible person. No, that's what the ego does. The ego likes to form attachments and identities to things. Take a step back, detach from the identification, and simply see yourself as the higher awareness that is acknowledging and conscious of, yeah, there is this feeling within me. There is this capacity to do harm within me. That's very different from, I am a person who does these sort of things. When you can finally come to terms with those feelings and express them in a symbolic way that is conscious, in this case it was a visualization that Guy Corneau did, or you could do drama therapy, breath work, psychedelic assisted therapy. There's many different healing modalities out there. But when you can finally do that, you free up that burden within your subconscious. And there is now, in the absence of that anger and rage that you've been holding, room to finally grieve. And then from grief, acceptance. And then from acceptance, gratitude, joy, and knowing that something else is possible, that healing and growth are possible. That's all for today's video. If you want to read and learn more about this topic, I have a blog on my website titled Breaking Up with Your Mother. In it, I share more detail about my own personal journey of healing from my mother complex, and also provide some resources that you can look into for yourself if you are also someone who is struggling or has struggled with this mother complex. Thanks again for watching, and I will see you in the next video.